Chav Zayin Amud Beis, and we're in the middle of the page. Mosiv Rova. So Chav 27b, middle of the page, Mosiv Rova. Okay, now again, just a little bit of review from yesterday, or really from Shabbos. Rava's question is on a very specific point. What we learned, there's a difference between Mo'is Stumin and Mo'is Mefaroshin. Specified money or unspecified money. We learned that either because of an oral tradition, a halacha l'moshe Sinai, or because of a gezeros hakosef, a specific biblical derivation, if you are a Nazir or a Nazira and you have unspecified money, and then for whatever reason you don't need that money, either because you were a Nazira, a woman who was a Nazir, and your husband nullified your Naziris, or potentially because, let's say, you were a Nazir and your father made you a Nazir, and then you grew up and you decided you don't want to be a Nazir. Which is also, and your father had already separated a sacrifice. In both cases, in both instances, the Mois Mefarashim specified, they had a pile of money that was used to buy Karbanis Nazir. They all go to Nedava. What does Nedava mean? It goes to an Oilis Kayat Samizbeach. If, however, you had three separate piles of money, or you had three animals, that's called Mois Mefarashim. We say the chatas money goes to the Mediterranean. Alternatively, the chatas itself, if you have actual chatas, is killed. We said that moiser chatas yamusu, the chatas that the owner has already had a kapara, an atonement. If there's an extra chatas for whatever reason, and there's nothing you can do with it, because the chatas can only come for the specific sin it was brought for. We'll see a little bit more about that. Then the animal is killed. Okay. Now we learned that an animal that was a balmum is called mois stumin. So in other words, let's say a guy, the karbonis of a nazir we said are 2 lambs and a ram. Let's say the guy goes ahead and he separates for Nazir, I don't know, a wounded elephant, or not an elephant wouldn't be a good example, or a wounded par, a wounded bull, which is fit for. Oh, okay. So a wounded bull, and then he's gonna have to sell the bull and use the money to buy the karbonis. In that case, we're on Chav Zayin Amud Beis, and we're at Mosiv Rova, middle of the page. Just a little bit of a background review. In that scenario, give me a second. In that scenario, the guy separates the balmum. We say the balmum, it's as if he separated money. So this wounded, again, blemish here we said is a very minor thing. It could be like a cut on the lips, but also suffices a blemish. So this blemished bull will be sold, and the money will be used to buy the 3 different sacrifices. And if the guy dies before he had a chance to sell it, or before he had a chance to buy the karbonis, that money is considered mois stumin, not mois mefaroshin. Okay, so yesterday we had a question on this. Today we have a similar question, but it's a long question, one long question basically for the next amud. And there's one minor point over here to pull out. But let's begin. Basically, the brisa is about not substituting other people's animals for your own. Okay, we'll soon see on Wednesday, God willing, that there is some sort of relationship between a father and a son as it pertains to Nazir. If the father leaves behind mois stumin, unspecified money, and the son becomes a Nazir after the father dies, the son is able to use the father's money. It's a unique halacha. So Mosiv Rava has brings in the following brisa. Karbonai b'karbonai. There is a concept of a Jewish leader sinning. So you have a leader, he's going to be a Nasi, or he's going to be an Av Bezdin. people make mistakes, and sometimes those people are leaders, and there's a process for him to bring in an atonement sacrifice, and it says Vehevius Karbani, he brings his carbon. What does that mean? It says Karbani actually 3 times in that parsha. What does his carbon mean? It has to be like he owns it. What exactly is that coming to limit? Karbani, his carbon, but Karbani who yaitzev any yaitzev carbon aviv. He can't bring his father as sacrifice. Let's say his father was a leader. His father sinned. His father dies before he had a chance to bring the carbon. He can't use his father's carbon. Yachal, I would think, that's only the case if his father, let's say, sinned by making a mistake in the laws of idol worship, and he made a mistake in the laws of chelav. So he's using a more severe animal for a lighter sin, or the opposite. His father sinned a minor. His father made a mistake in a minor area. He made a mistake in a major area. So you can't, in other words, you can't switch it for a sin that's of a different classification. But let's say it's the same category of sin. Then maybe he could use his father's sacrifice. Therefore, the verse says, he needs his own carbon and not he can't use his father's sacrifice. One second. Okay, so in other words, now I know that he can't use his father's sacrifice in either the scenario of a more stringent to a less stringent set of laws, or even in the same category, but it's a different sin. So his father sinned by making a mistake in the laws of chelav, the forbidden fats, and he made a mistake in the laws of dam, of blood, forbidden bloods. A Jew is not allowed to eat the blood of an animal. Okay. So I understand that he can't switch it for a different sin, just like he can't use his father's sacrifices if he's a Nazir. Like we said before, this concept that a son can use his father's sacrifices is limited just to the scenario of mo'is stumen. Right? What does mo'is stumen mean? Unspecified funds. Okay, so I get it, but actual karbonos the son is not able to use his father's karbonos. So because that's the case, the father can't use his son's karbonos, the son can't use the father's karbonos. It sort of makes sense why the son can't use the karbonos of his father, whether they're in the appropriate category, whether they're more severe or less severe. That all makes sense. But now what do I think? We're 3 lines in the bottom of 27b. First one line is b'mois. Aval yaitzi b'mois shehifresh aviv afilu min hachamura al hakala and min hakala al hachamura. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, until now we're talking about karbonos. Now we're going to switch to the conversation about money. Maybe money, if the father separated money for a chatos and the son makes a mistake in a more milder sin, maybe the son is able to use the same money. I'm in a kal al chamura, or the opposite, where it's more lenient to more stringent. Sure, because if his father has mois stumen, unspecified money, then the son is able to use that money to purchase an animal in the scenario of Nazir. Okay, so in other words, maybe I should compare Nazir to the laws of somebody using his father's karbonos. I should just add here a moment. The framework here we're using is called Harius. As a matter of fact, there's an entire Masechta called Harius. Short and difficult Masechta. Harius is... It's short. What was that?
At least it's short.
Yeah. Harius is the concept of... We're talking about mistakes here. Typically, a regular carbon chatos. Why would somebody bring a regular carbon chatos? the classical chatos, meaning the original example of a korban chatos the Torah says you need to bring, it's called a chatos chelav. It's a chatos for eating forbidden fats. The general rule is it has to be a Torah prohibition whose penalty for negligent offense is kares. That's the category. And again, the classical example is chelav, eating forbidden fats. The harius example is a case where he makes a mistake in Torah law, or a mistake in actual practice. There are different types of sacrifices, depending on what type of mistake it was. But it could be a mistake in dictating the law. It could also be a mistake in practice. Okay, but regardless, we saw now so far we've seen that you can't use your father's karbanos, whether they're in the same category, whether they're a more stringent or more lenient category. Now, what about the money? So now we're on top of Chesam and Aleph. Talmud loimer karbonai. It has to be his carbon. Karbonai yaitzev any yaitzev carbon oven. You can't use your father's money to buy a carbon. So the Gemara says, okay, I understand. Okay, so that makes sense that I can't use my father's money to buy a carbon if it's in the wrong category. But maybe aval yaitzev carbon shehefer shel atzim min hakala al hakala. 1 second, hold on here. Hang on a second. Okay, in other words, it's true that he can't use his father's money for the wrong sacrifice. You together on that? Now, what about using his own money? So he made two mistakes. Let's say so typically in chatos, again, like we said, the classical chatos is a chatos chelav, but there could be more severe types. If you're a nasi and you make a mistake in avodah zarah, you can incur a more severe penalty, or within the category of chatos itself. So let's say a guy eats chelav by mistake, and he also violates Shabbos by mistake. Let me just clarify for a moment. What does a mistake mean? Anyone remembers?
Unintended.
What does that mean, unintended?
Accident? He was it's just an accidental thing. No,
There's two types of mistakes. We'll learn about this in Masechta Shavuos. God willing, in a year plus, well over a year plus. Okay. Masechta Shavuos, we learn this in. Okay, let me back up here. There are many types of mistakes. Oh, people make many mistakes. Okay, obviously, but in order to bring a korban chatos, your mistake has to be. You have to have four components of the mistake. There are 4 components you need to have. Okay. Number 1 is that there was a time that you knew it was wrong. Okay. And number 2, point number 2 is that there was a time that you remembered it was wrong. So in other words, you have somebody who knows that Shabbos is a day that we don't do malacha. We don't turn on the coffee machine on Shabbos. What? We'll get to that in a moment. And we have somebody that at a later point remembered that Shabbos is the day we don't turn on the coffee machine. Okay. Then in the middle, he forgot. What did he forget? He forgot one of 2 things. Either he forgot that it was Shabbos, or he forgot that turning on a coffee machine is prohibited. So you need one of those. You need those. So it's really 3 steps. You knew in the beginning, you knew at the end, and in the middle you forgot either there was a helam malacha or there was a helam of the yom. You forgot it was Shabbos, or you forgot it was. That's the type. When we talk about a mistake here, this is the type of. If you're not in this category, you do not bring a korban chatos, by and large, and you'll bring 1 chatos for every time you remember. So, for example, let's say a guy has a long bout of amnesia or some sort of other illness, and he forgets 6 weeks in a row that you're not allowed to turn on a coffee machine on Shabbos. And every week for 6 weeks, he turns on the coffee machine. How many karbonos does he bring? 1. Because there's 1 forgetting.
Oh,
There's 1 forgetting. Now there is an opinion that you'd bring 6 because the fact that they're different Shabbosim separates. Yeah. Certainly, everybody would agree that if he turned on the machine 6 times in the same Shabbos, He bring one carbon because it was one forgetting, and that's the key unit of carbon chatas. But that's just as an aside. But talk about forgetting here. It's certain types of casual forgetfulness are not included in carbon chatas. Like they're called misasik, they're called einus, different categories that don't result in a chatas. Chatas is a very specific type of forgetting. Okay, be that as it may, a guy makes two mistakes. He forgets to he eats the forbidden fats, and he also turns on the coffee machine on Shabbos. So maybe then he separates money for the coffee machine problem, and then he decides to use that money for the chaylev problem. Maybe that's acceptable. So that's what the Gemara is addressing now. Okay, so we are 1 second. Right. So we are 5 lines down, second one on the line, 28a. But if the guy separates, in this case, we're talking about a sacrifice, not yet money, a sacrifice. So he separates a sacrifice for his chaylev problem. He also recognizes he has a Shabbos problem. He wants to switch the sacrifice to a different category of sin. So we might say that Shabbos might be a little bit more stringent than the laws of chaylev. Talmud Loimar, so the verse states, "Karbonai al chatotzi, achi karbonai l'shum chetoi." The sacrifice has to be for the specific sin. Okay, so now I understand. So I understand now that you cannot use if you have a sacrifice, meaning an actual animal. What type of animal? A female animal. Right, because chatas is always going to be female, and it's also always going to be premature, young one. So a lamb or a calf. So I understand that you have a calf, a female calf, and you want to switch it for a different sin. It doesn't work. I get it. If you bring a chatas for the wrong sin, then the sacrifice is an acceptable sacrifice. In other words, you have not violated any commandment by bringing the wrong sacrifice, but you do not achieve atonement for either sin. So if a guy has a carbon dedicated for a sin of Shabbos, and then we'll call it a chatas Shabbos, and then he performs it as a chatas chaylev. The law is he does not fulfill his atonement either for the chatas chaylev or for the chatas Shabbos, but as a sacrifice, it's actually accepted, meaning that the sacrifice is considered to have completed its purpose. So therefore, he didn't benefit from it, right? Because he's supposed to bring another 2 sacrifices. But the sacrifice is kosher, so we say it's loy ma'al. He does not. He hasn't misused hektish, even though he's misused it, but he hasn't benefited from it. Okay. So therefore, it makes sense that you can't take a carbon of chatas chaylev and use it for a chatas Shabbos. But money maybe could be switched around. Maybe if he has money dedicated for the chatas Shabbos, he can reallocate it for the chatas of chaylev. Maybe it could be switched. In that scenario, okay, so now let's say he takes money and he has money dedicated to a chatas he has money dedicated to a chatas chaylev, switches it to a chatas Shabbos. So in that scenario, what happens if he actually did that? He took money by mistake. The law is that there is me'ila here. Because you use the money to buy a valid carbon, and the carbon was bought with the purpose of being not what the money was separated for, you actually achieve atonement on that sin. So again, you had money dedicated for a chatas Shabbos. You use that money instead to buy a chatas chaylev, brought it as a chatas chaylev. You achieve atonement on your sin of chaylev, and therefore you're moyal. Therefore, you violated the laws of hektish with benefit because you've actually benefited from the sacrifice. If that's the case, I would think that you should be allowed to switch the money. So the Gemara says, you have to, the atonement has to be for the sin that was specified at the time that you separated the money. So you cannot basically use the money. If the money was separated for chaylev, you can't use it for Shabbos. Okay, So, okay, this is all very nice. Now, getting back to the original Gemara. Okay, the Gemara's point is very specific here. We pointed out that a fellow cannot use his father's karbanos, can't use his father's money either. Okay, and the Gemara pointed out that he could use his father's mo'is stumin of Nazir in a select scenario, which we'll see later on. But what he can't use is his father's karbanos. And the Gemara implies that any type of animal that the father left him, he would not be able to use to bring his own karbanos, including an animal that's a balmum, it's blemished. Evidently, it's the case that a blemished animal is considered mois mifuroshim and not mois stumin. Together? And obviously, what's the resolution? No, the resolution is that no, an animal is considered money and not considered a carbon. So why doesn't the Gemara, instead of using an example of money, why doesn't it use an example of balmum, of a blemished animal? So the Gemara says because it is money. It's the same thing. A blemished animal is the same as money. Okay, which is the same resolution as the Gemara gave from Rav Huna that we saw yesterday. Okay. We're talking about an animal that's unblemished. But what's the story of balas mum? You're telling me that it's going to be considered like unspecified money. So if that's the case, why do we give an example of money of the father? Listening balas mum, we could talk about an animal that's blemished. So Gemara says you're right. It's true. What exactly can you use a blemished animal for? The dummy, for money. Dummy, money is money. Money is money. In other words, the value, effectively using a blemished animal is for the value inside of it. That value is money, and that's the same as the Gemara is saying. The Gemara's example of money. Okay. Next Gemara. Nizir, the Mishnah on Chav Chesed Aleph. Nizir Allah echad min adam. Eini yachal lahafer. If the guy, okay, so they begin to perform. So again, we have a woman who's a Nazira. She brings her karbanos, right? She brings 1 second. She brings 3 karbanos, right? And what was he saying? She has chatos and oila and shlomim. She brings her karbanos, and her husband hears about it. Once they started, so they slaughtered the animals. They started putting the blood on the altar, on the mizbeach. So what happens? Then the husband decides he wants to be mefer. He wants to nullify the vow. So the Gemara says, "Any achal hafer," he cannot nullify the vow. We'll get to the. I'm sorry.
Too late, right?
Too late. We'll get to the details in the Gemara today. Okay, and point out the points as we go along. Rabbi Kiva says, "I feel a nishchat olah even before zrika." So again, typically the main component of a korban is zrika, pouring the blood on the mizbeach. That's considered the moment where the atonement happens. If at that point everything is lost, it becomes tamei, it disappears, it vanishes, it gets burnt, whatever it is, by mistake, it's fine. Everything else is fine, generally speaking. Okay, so the rabbi's opinion makes a lot of sense then, because then she's had her atonement, or the korban's considered to have been validated. But Kiva says even afilu nishchatola, even once it's slaughtered, achas mikol behemoth, one of the animals, any yachol hafer, he cannot nullify the neder. The Gemara says, okay, but when is this true? When she completed her Nazirus b'tahara, with purity, and now she's ending it. But let's say she became impure, in which case she needs to restart her Nazirus. So then, he can say to her, I don't want a woman who's going to do another cycle of Nazirus. So in other words, just like the husband can nullify Nazirus in the beginning or in the middle or even toward the end, he can, if she's bringing the karbanos of tumah, he can say in the middle, I don't want you to be a Nazir a second time. So then he can invalidate it. Obviously, a husband is limited to the day that he heard it to invalidate the Nazirus. So all these situations all have to be that he's nullifying it the day he heard it. Okay. The husband is able to nullify his wife's neder even after she's brought the sacrifices, because part of the conclusion of Nazirus is that the hair is shaved, and he doesn't want his wife to have her hair completely shaved off. And that's a legitimate argument. What about, and therefore he's within his boundaries to nullify the neder. If anyone remembers from the Nedarim, we learned that Hafaras Nedarim of a husband needs to have a neder that has ino nefesh, it has pain. Right? So effectively, what Rameir is saying is that there's pain up until and including the moment that she starts cutting her hair. So you can nullify the neder even after she's brought her korbanos. Now, why is that not called ino nefesh if, according to the rabbis, she brought one sacrifice? They did zrika. All of a sudden, it can't be made for. What about the fact that she has to cut her hair? Why is that not called ino nefesh? Why is that not called a neder that has pain? So Gemara says because she could wear a wig. That we'll get to tomorrow. I'm sorry, we'll get to later. Hopefully later today. Okay, let's finish up now. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer. Our Mishnah does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer, ha'amar tekalachas ma'akevas. Rabbi Eliezer says that until you shave your head, you cannot drink wine. The kivin de gilcha asira b'chamra. Since shaving the head is considered an integral part of the completion of Nazirus, so until then she's prohibited she's prohibited to drink wine. The kivin de isla nivel matzimefer, and because you can't drink wine, he should be able to nullify the neder because there's an inu nefesh there. So the Gemara says you're right. Tana di don savar kivin de izdarak al adam la'alter asharia b'chamra ha'les lanivel. The opinion of our Mishnah is that once the blood has been poured on the altar, the mizbeach, then there is at that point she is permitted to drink wine, and therefore there's no inu nefesh, there's no pain. Okay. Rabbi Kiva says, "Afilu ishtchitas behema eina yachol hafer." Rabbi Kiva says, even once the animal has been slaughtered, at that point you can no longer nullify the neder. Why not? Mishum hefsid kachim. Okay, it's complicated. Taisus here has a doubt. I think phrase it. I think what Taisus' point here is pretty logical. Taisus' point is that look, if you once the animal is slaughtered, if you nullify the neder, the animal is going to go to the garbage. The husband nullify neder. What happens if he does it anyway? So Taisus is not sure. Taisus is not sure that if the rabbis let his hafara stand or they sort of nullify his hafara. What the mechanism of that is complicated of how they would do that, but that's a question Taisus leaves as an open question. But it seems to be rabbinical in nature. Okay, Maskefler Rav Zera had the following question: V'amai, why is it going to be a loss of kachim? Lizrak damin shaloi l'shman v'yater basar b'achilo. It should be a simple solution here. The guy brings the three korbanos he brings. Okay, chadas will put aside for the moment. The oil and the shlamim were brought as a portion of completing the nazir. Now it's too late, right? In other words, they slaughter the oil, they slaughter the shlamim, one or two or both, and at this point, he nullifies the neder. Okay, so that means that the purpose of the oil and the shlamim can no longer be fulfilled because there is no nazirus here. Fine, so bring it anyway. What's the problem? There's a concept of bringing a korban shaloi l'shman. This should never happen, but it could happen. You know, and it's interesting in Kachim, I pointed this out before, we have a number of things that should never happen. We have all sorts of laws to clarify what happens if people do it anyway. Okay, anyway, but you have such a situation where a guy, kivset, milatani, did we not learn? Kivset saras. Okay, so a guy brings a guy, 1 second here. Yeah, okay. A guy brings a sheep for a kivset sarah. So this is on Yom Tov, there's somebody who does oila regal is commanded to bring korban oila. He's also commanded to bring a chagiga. In other words, to partake in the meat of a sacrifice while he's, during his sojourn in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, what happens if they slaughter that without the intention that this should be a chagiga? In other words, he slaughtered it, I don't know, as if it was a regular shlamim. without the correct purpose. So what do? Hadam Yizrak, you pour the blood on the Mizbeach, v'habasar yochel, you eat the meat. Okay. What happens if it was Shabbos, and Maisa Shabbos, where you should not have been slaughtering it? Lo Yizrak, Mzara Kurtza. So then you don't pour the blood on the Mizbeach. But if you did, then you have, you completed the carbon. And Hurtz Lahakri Murim Larav, you can bring the rest of the meat can be put on the altar in the evening. Okay. The point of the question here is, so bring it anyway. So you have a carbon, an oila and a shlomim that cannot be brought as the oila and shlom of Nazir, simply because the woman is no longer a Nazir. Her husband was made for it. Fine, so bring it anyway. Just like we see that other karbanos, if they're brought without the correct purpose in mind, the karbanos are still valid. So what's the problem here? So the Gemara says Amri as follows. The answer is as follows: Either shachat oila shlomim. If they slaughter the oila and the shlomim, then you're right. Hachanami, it's true that the husband could still nullify it, because if he does, what happens? Nothing. You bring the oila, you bring the shlomim, and you put it on top of his mizbeach, and everything is fine. And what are we talking about? Where the chatas is the first one to be slaughtered. It's now, like we learned in Gilach al achas mishloshtan yotza. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, when the rabbis mention here that you can drink wine once one of the sacrifices are slaughtered, or the blood is poured in the mizbeach, they're talking about the chatos, and they're talking about what Rabbi Kiva was talking about, because Rabbi Kiva is one of the sacrifices. It's not really anyone; it's specifically the chatos, because the chatos shalal lishman cannot be brought. Like we saw, a chatos has to be brought for a specific person for a specific sin. And if she's no longer a nazir, she can't bring a chatos. So therefore must be, we're talking about the chatos that's slaughtered according to Rabbi Kiva. And once the chatos is slaughtered, if the husband were to nullify the naziros, then the chatos would go to waste. Okay, let's finish over here. Okay, so we learned that there's a difference between tekalachas tahara and tekalachas tumah. Right, in tekalachas tumah, if she's bringing her karbanos because she became tamei, in which case she brings a chatos, an asham, and an ayla. In that case, everyone agrees that the husband can still nullify the neder because he doesn't want his wife to be a nazir for second round. Okay. The Tanakama. Okay, now the question is, Ramera says that she can that the husband can nullify the naziris even after the karbanos, before the sacrifices were brought. And obviously, the question is, what about the Rabbanan? Why is it not acceptable for a husband not to demand his wife not shave her heads? So the Gemara says, it's possible to use a wig here of a non-Jewish woman. Okay. And Rameir says, because there's the obviously whoever grew the wig, you have her sweat and oils and whatever stuff, so it's not pleasant for a woman to wear a wig, and therefore she does not have to wear a wig, and that's considered enough of an inoy, enough of a pain, that the husband is able to nullify the neder. According to the rabbis, it's not enough, and he is not able to nullify the naziros. Obviously, it's before the days of shampoo and other modern inventions. Okay. They had ash. So I'm not sure. Ash works pretty well, I think. No. What? It cleans pretty well, actually. What? Yeah. Okay. What time is it? Let's stop there.
The wood wouldn't smell too well.
Okay.